In today's video, we're going to cover the promise.allSettled method within JavaScript. First, we're going to talk about a conceptual explanation of how this method works. Then we're going to get into some examples and use cases. And then we're going to end with how it's different than some of the other promise methods. So first things first, what is the promise.allSettled method? Well, it is a method on the overall promise object that you get for free within JavaScript. And I will show you examples of how this works in a second. But it is a method that exists on that object. And what it's going to do is it's going to take an array of promises or an iterable of promises, and it's going to return a promise that will fulfill when every promise from your input array has either fulfilled or rejected. And then for every promise that either fulfills or rejects, it is going to represent that with an object. And each object is going to have a status string telling you whether the promise was fulfilled or rejected. So that status is going to be fulfilled or rejected. And then if the promise was fulfilled, then your promise object is also going to have a value property. And that value is going to point to whatever value that promise fulfilled with. But if your promise was rejected, then it's going to have a status of rejected. And then instead of a value property, it's going to have a reason property. And that reason property is going to point to whatever that promise rejects with. So a reason for why that promise rejects. All right, so if that doesn't make a ton of sense right now, let me show you an example of this. So in this example here, I'm going to create two separate promises. Promise 1 here on line 22 and promise 2 here on line 24. And I'm basically just going to use the promise constructor within JavaScript to create these promises. And my first promise is going to be a promise that rejects after 100 milliseconds with the value of quick. And then my second promise, promise 2 here, it's going to be a promise that resolves after 500 milliseconds with the value of slow. And then I place these promises into a promise array. And then for the promise.allSettled method here, I'm going to pass it an array of promises. So I'm passing it my array of promises here. And then the promise.allSettled method, it's going to return a promise. So I can handle that return value with either the .then, the .catch, or the .finally methods. And those methods are going to run once my allSettled methods promise resolves. And my allSettled methods promise is going to resolve when all of my input array promises either fulfill or reject. And it's going to return an array here within my resolved promise, in which each item of that array is going to be an object representing each promise of my passed in input. And like I said, those objects are going to have a status property that is either fulfilled or rejected. And then if a promise was fulfilled, it's going to have a value property pointing to the value that promise was fulfilled with. And then if it rejects, it's going to have a reason property pointing to the reason why that promise rejects. So if I run my code here, you're going to see that I get an array here of objects in which each object represents one of my passed in promises. And my first promise, it's going to have a status of rejected because I reject that promise here. And it's going to have a reason because it rejects. It's going to have a reason property, and that's going to be with a value of quick here. And then for my second promise here, I set that promise to resolve. So it's going to have the status of fulfilled, and then it resolves with a value of slow. So it's going to have the value pointing to slow. So the promise.all method, it's going to return a promise. And this promise is going to contain a value, which is an array, this array that you see here. And each item of this array is going to be an object that represents one of your passed in promises within your promise array that you pass to the allSettled method. And then each object is for sure going to have a status property, and it's either going to be rejected or fulfilled. And if it was rejected, then it's also going to have a reason property for the reason why it rejected. But if it fulfills, then it's going to have a value property pointing to the value that it fulfills with. Okay, so this gives you a way to handle multiple promises, either rejecting or fulfilling, and handling either case, whether they reject or fulfill. But how is this method different than some of the other promise methods? Well, for the promise.any method, it's just going to return the first resolved promise. So if I change this to promise.any and I run this code, you're going to see that it's only going to return the first promise that fulfills. So since I only have one promise that fulfills and it fulfills with a value of slow, promise.any is just going to return the first value that fulfills. So the promise.any method, it's not going to wait for all of your methods to fulfill or reject like promise.allSettled. And that's kind of the same thing with promise.race. Promise.race, it's not going to wait for every promise to resolve or reject like the promise.allSettled method will. It's going to return the first either fulfilled or rejected value. So if we run this with promise.race, you see that we're going to get quick because my promise 1, that's going to reject after 100 milliseconds, which is going to be before promise 2 that resolves after 500 milliseconds. So since promise.race, it doesn't care whether something rejects or fulfills, it's just going to return the first resolved or rejected promise. But promise.allSettled, it's going to wait for all those promises and return an array of objects representing each promise. And promise.any, it's going to ignore rejected promises, just returning the first fulfilled one. Now promise.all is different than promise.allSettled because it returns an array of all of your fulfilled promises. But if any promise rejects within the promise.all method, then it will immediately reject your returned promise from promise.all. It's not going to wait for all promises that either reject or resolve. It's only going to wait for resolved promises, and then if something rejects, it's just going to reject everything right away, short circuit it, and not wait for any other promises. So if I change this to promise.all here, you're going to see that it's just going to reject here with the value of quick. And it's not going to wait for all of my promises. But if I change this to resolve, now it's going to return an array of all of the values within my resolved promises here, because I resolve this and it waits for both resolved promises since there's no rejection. Now, you might be thinking that promise.all and promise.allSettled are very similar, and they are. The main difference is when a promise gets rejected, promise.all is going to immediately reject everything, but allSettled, it doesn't care whether it resolves or rejects. It's just going to return an array of objects representing all those promises, whether they resolve or reject. So the promise.allSettled method, you might use this method in a case in which you want to have multiple asynchronous operations happen at the same time, and you want them to happen in parallel, but they are independent of one another. Meaning, if one of your promises rejects, you don't want to reject all other promises. You're okay with just handling those independently. That's where you'd use allSettled over promise.all. But if your promises were all dependent on each other, and if one rejected, you want them all to reject, then you would use promise.all. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a good idea on how the allSettled method works within JavaScript. I have other videos covering all the other methods in a little bit more depth, as well as some different use cases and examples of when these methods are useful. So thanks for tuning into this, and I will see you in that next one.